everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Have We Got Planning News for You. We are gathered, the three of us today, Sasha, Paul and myself, to talk to you about the draft National Planning Policy Framework, which was issued today. And we have Charlie and Chris pre-recording and joining remotely, hence I'm introducing this. So without further ado, I'm going to start by inviting Paul to tell us about Part 3 and local plans and strategic policies. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. Well, lots to say in relation to local plans, I have to say. Let me come back to Part 3, Chapter 3 in just a moment. Can I pick up some of the bits from towards the end of the plan, the NPPF? The first thing is, in the written ministerial statement, the Secretary of State wants us to have universal plan coverage as soon as possible, and in any event by the end of the Parliament. I am long enough in the tooth to remember when we were told in PPG 12, I think it was, that we would have universal plan, local plan coverage by the millennium. So I wish this particular administration good luck in that aspiration. It's also right to say that the consultation draft of the NPPF is going to be followed by a final version of NPPF by the end of the year. That's important. While I just turn my phone off. That's important because of things that come forward as to the procedure. So for authorities that are currently dragging their feet in relation to plan making, there is an opportunity with the consultation draft out to look to try and make up some lost ground and to bring themselves potentially into one of the categories. So paragraph 226 of the consultation draft of NPPF, which tells us that these will be requirements triggered from the publication date of the NPPF plus 1 month. Firstly, if you are at examination, in other words, it's a submitted plan, and your requirement is within 200 units per annum of the new standard figure, which Chris will describe, because those seem to have gone up quite a lot in some areas. But if you're within 200 units of that, all great, you can get your plan adopted under the current existing system. But if you are beyond 200 units per annum of the whatever your requirement is, then you have to commit to an immediate plan review. Not too different, therefore, if you're at examination. If you're at Reg 19 stage and you are more than 200 units from the housing figure, then there is an obligation upon you not to submit, but to take account of the higher figure and rework your figures, which may be a bit of a delay in terms of plan making, and the Secretary of State recognises that in terms of her statement, but is considered important enough notwithstanding that delay. And if you are before Reg 19, then you have to use the new figures and have to use the new NPPF. There's an important element in the written ministerial statement at Chapter 10, which is that the Secretary of State is consulting upon different approaches to the powers of intervention. She makes it very clear in the consultation document that she intends to use her powers of intervention. She says that in the written ministerial statement. And the new revised criteria that's been consulted upon is that an authority fails to do what is required to do to put a plan in place or to keep it up to date. So there's a stick that's been held, a Damoclean sword that's been dangled over authorities that think sitting and doing nothing isn't going to work. Is going to work to avoid all this because the Secretary of State wants plans in place by the end of the Parliament and will use her powers of intervention. In terms of Chapter 3, it's paragraph 27 that you really need to focus upon. It's a little unclear about how this is going to be enforced. However, strategic policy-making authorities have got to make sure, by reason of paragraph 27, that their plans are going to be consistent with other bodies where there is a strategic relationship in relation to those matters. So, for example, logistics in the West Midlands, where there's lots of joint studies that are kicking out there, and that's relevant to another point I'll come to, there is an obligation to collaborate, sort of like the duty to cooperate, and we'll see how that pans out in practice, except for the words, you've then got to demonstrate that you've got the relevant works done, unless there's a clear justification to the contrary, to ensure that a consistent position is being taken and that unmet needs from neighbouring authorities are accommodated, and also that any allocation or designation cutting across boundary areas is appropriately managed. And the end of paragraph 28 says, plans sometimes come forward in different orders. Well, if they do, It's for plan maker number 1 to take a view about what's happening in relation to plan maker number 2 who's following on, not to do what a number of authorities do, which is to put it into the too difficult pile and say, oh, don't worry about it, we'll collaborate later. So that's a big, big change in relation to that. And I suspect that's the stick to ensure that we will get a more effective approach to duty to cooperate. How it works out in practice is a different issue. Greenbelt, I think, is going to be covered by Charlie in just a minute, but just can I flag up a couple of things from a plan-making perspective? Firstly, viability in relation to site release is picked up in a new annex to the NPPF. Right at the very back, it's Annex 4, which is essentially saying if you've got a release of a site from Greenbelt on the basis of what will be exceptional circumstances for release, for example, of houses, where it's got to be a minimum of 50% affordable, then you have to go through the viability approach that's set out in Annex 4. So it really quite interesting, and it also tells you that exceptional circumstances can be met for Greenbelt release by not meeting your housing needs, which includes housing and also commercial. So you can no longer say we don't think exceptional circumstances are met, even though there is some need for something, I don't know, a large data center or something of that nature. You can't duck the responsibility anymore. You've got to do it, and that can comprise exceptional circumstances justifying Greenbelt release. So paragraphs 142 and 155 of the draft are the ones that no doubt Charlie will tell you a little more about. And then the final couple of paragraphs, just to mention in relation to plan making, less sexy than the housing stuff that Chris will no doubt speak about. But in terms of employment issues, I do urge people to look at paragraph 84B and 85, where there is an express endorsement to plan for big-scale development, i.e. data centers, gigafactories, and large-scale freight logistics. If you add that together with what's set out in the earlier part of the plan, particularly paragraph 27, it's telling local authorities you now have to collaborate to deal with things which are required to be dealt with on a strategic basis. You can't just say, oh, we'll leave it off to another report. You can't do that. This is essentially trying to say we're bringing in strategic planning, not quite by the back door. I think it's coming in by the front door with a welcome mat.
Oh, Paul, I so agree. And well done, by the way. I'd want everybody to know that you're in the middle of an inquiry and you've somehow managed to get all that together, and I salute you. And yes, what I was really excited about was this. Universal strategic planning covering functional economic areas is planned within 5 years.
Yes.
So, yes, I think that is welcome news indeed. Now, Sasha, you're going to tell us about the economic implications in the draft. Over to you.
I am, Mary, but before I do, I just thought to assist those watching this podcast, I would just set out the 4 key documents or sources that I think really help, and they can go down the same journey I've taken today, which of course is the NPPF itself, which is of course on the government website. Secondly, there is a comparison version that quite a lot of people posted on LinkedIn, which is really helpful, which shows you exactly the nature of the changes, because it must be emphasised the vast majority of the NPPF is retained. The third document is the introduction to the consultation, where there's a commentary, which is very helpful, which was found by Paul. And the fourth thing, which I think is worth bringing to everyone's attention, is the actual letter from the Secretary of State as well. So I think to really get to grips with what has been published today, those 4 sources give one a pretty comprehensive picture. Now, I'm going to talk about Chapter 6 and building a strong and competitive economy, and Paul has noted in the context of development plans the changes to 84 and 85, and I think this is really quite a powerful signpost of what the government wants to see happen with the economy. I mean, we heard during the election, and we heard from Rachel Reeves post the election, how seriously this government take economic growth, and I think that's absolutely set out in the consultation document, where it's identified the first comment is about the power of the planning system to bring about growth in the economy. So one cannot underestimate how much importance is placed on it. That manifests itself in the 2 changes that Paul has already mentioned in 84 and 85, but I think it's really powerful that there is actually the identification of 5 sectors, the economic sectors, I mean, Charlie will know well from his recent litigation about what you do with paragraph 83 and 84 and 85. But what actually is identified for the first time is splitting an economic pie chart, so to speak. And I think there are 5 areas specifically pointed out of importance. Laboratories, which are important, and I know there's been a recent appeal in Cambridge North dealing with proposed labs. Gigafactories, which I also know is that there have been recent appeal decisions. Data centres, digital infrastructure, and I know Paul's just finished of inquiries in freight and logistics. Now, what has happened is, I think, is this absolute identification in the development plan context, as Paul has identified in 84, the new 84, but I think it's also noteworthy what's changed in 85. The planning decision should absolutely recognise and address the particular location requirements for different sectors, and that particularly includes these requirements for new service and infrastructure that need to support the growth of those industries. So it's noteworthy, not just, frankly, positive statement, but seeking the growth, not the status quo. And all 3 of us have been involved in development plans and that debate about, frankly, not seeking growth, establishing the status quo, or positively seeking growth. I think one should be in no doubt that the NPPF expressly in relation to both economic growth and specifically those 5 industries wants to see actual growth. It's also noteworthy that those 5 industries aren't alone, because what's also sought is the expansion or modernisation of other industries of local, regional, and national importance to support economic growth and resilience. So I think the headline is that the clear intention is a policy framework at national level which embraces and endorses growth. It endorses growth specifically to 5 industries, and it also endorses growth of existing industries through their modernisation and expansion. So those are the key changes. Now, I did also want to identify, because I think it's important, what's said by the Secretary of State. And if you look at what's said by the Secretary of State, this is the letter of today, and there's a specific section on effectively growth supporting infrastructure. And I think it's noteworthy, and I'm sure, Mary, you'll touch upon this, that there's a particular mention of renewable energy, and that's obviously an important point. But also expressly said is building more homes, and the justification is, of course, fundamental to unlocking growth, but we need to do so much more. And that is why we're proposing changes to make it easier to build growth supporting infrastructure. And I think that is worth, frankly, reflecting on for a moment. The express desire of the government is to make it easier, i.e. through the planning system, to build growth supporting infrastructures. And again, those 5 specific industries are mentioned by the Secretary of State. And there's also the other element is the request for views as to whether those 5 industries should be drawn into the nationally significant infrastructure project process. So for all of those of you who have got projects that involve those 5 industries, both, there should be a consideration of the policy and also the way that that policy is achieved through the process, i.e. through the traditional planning system, or whether they go into the national infrastructure. Now, I think what is important to note that when one looks at the consultation as well, and what is sought, that everything I've said is absolutely set out as well in the consultation, and what the Chancellor said on the 8th of July, obviously just 4 days after the general election, importance of the growth. And again, the consultation version says that the NPPF changes expressly seek to support economic investment and construction of key modernised industries to support economic growth. And that also means, I think there's expressly those 5 or 4 industries are absolutely identified in the kind of levels of growth, and being no mistake, the level of growth that the government is seeking is really quite remarkable in relation to labs, gigafactories, digital infrastructure, and freight and logistics. And I mean, just it's quite noteworthy that they identified that now freight and logistics employ nearly 1.2 million people. So when you think of a working population roughly of 30 million, that shows the significance of that sector. And I just think that there is then also a way of looking at expressly what they seek to do about those industries. So I think the headline and takeaway points is everything that was said during the general election by the Labour Party of what they wanted to do with economic growth has actually reached manifestation and expression through the proposed changes. And over the next year, if this version of the NPPF is obviously adopted post-consultation, and of course we know everyone's got till the 24th of September to give their views, we can see quite a material change, frankly, in the national policy context to both industries specifically identified and general economic industries. Thank you, Mary.
Oh, thank you.
Sasha, you haven't answered the important question, which is, are those your special Scottish Pride of Miss Jean Brodie glasses? I don't think I've seen those before.
No, they are. They're my normal glasses. Maybe they look different because they've crossed the border.
Possibly so.
I think they're very judicial looking myself, Sasha. And thank you very much indeed for that excellent summary. Now, I'm going to hand over to young Chris, who is dealing with housing numbers and Chapter 5. So, over to you, Chris.
I'm going to deal with the all-important issue of housing numbers, which is absolutely the bedrock of this new NPPF. And I'm going to do it by highlighting 10 key points. Point 1, the government requires 1.5 million homes to be delivered within this Parliament. So within the next 5 years, just as was promised in the Labour Party election manifesto. That is, for the mathematically challenged, 300,000 homes each year for the next 5 years of this Parliament. It was, in fact, the lowest figure of all the three main parties, but it is by far the most realistic. Unlike the other parties, Labour have introduced for the first time a credible way of achieving that target because of the second point. And the second point is that they've introduced a standard method formula which is mandatory for all authorities. And that's because they are removing the exceptional circumstance test from the NPPF, which allowed local authorities to wriggle out of the figure and plead for something lower. So the Labour government are sticking with the standard method as a way of calculating local housing need, and they're making it a mandatory requirement to adopt the standard method figure, subject to the caveats identified below. But crucially, and this is the third main point, the standard figure adds up to a national target of 371,000 homes a year. And that's up from the current target of 305,000 homes a year. So that's an increase of 66,000 homes nationally across the country. And that's vital because some local authorities, as we shall see, will not be planning for the standard method figure. So it needs to be a figure well above 300,000 if the 300,000 a year is to be delivered. Moving on to the fourth point, how will the government arrive, or how did they arrive at that figure? Well, crucially, they've got rid of the household projections and replaced them with a new approach based on a straightforward annual increase in the number of houses in each area. This is called the so-called stock increase approach, which is basically just an increase in the stock of housing in the area. And that's an increase of 0.8% of the existing housing each and every year. And then added to that is an affordability adjustment, a 0.6% uplift. Previously, it was just 0.25%. And the new government has also removed the cap, which was in place to lessen the burden of new housing on more affluent areas. And they've removed the city uplift, which was a 35% increase for the 20 biggest cities and obviously all of the London boroughs. Now, why is that important? Because the household projections have precisely nothing to do with housing need. They were the biggest problem in the UK planning system as far as planning for the correct number of houses was concerned. Household projections simply project forward past trends in household formation rates, which have been suppressed for the last 4 decades because housing has got more and more expensive. Robert Gendrick was the first to suggest a stock-based approach, but he got cold feet, as we know, when his own backbenchers started to rebel against his suggested changes to the formula. Paul and I led a group which was examining this issue at the time. We called it the group Standard Method North, as the parties involved were all concerned that housing figures in the Midlands and the north of England were too low, and in fact below the annual delivery rate. So we formed a group of about 80 interested parties, including registered providers and developers and land promoters, and advised by 10 different planning consultancies, their econometrics experts and their housing numbers experts. And we submitted that to the government. And the conclusion of that group was that a stock-based approach would be the best solution. And today that has happened. More of those figures and what they actually look like for various different districts and different regions in a moment. But to continue the list, number 5, paragraph 11b of the NPPF remains. So despite the standard method being the mandatory figure for calculating housing need, local authorities will still be able to argue for a lower figure where they have constraints in the area, as set out by footnote 7 of the NPPF. So, of course, there will be many authorities that continue to do that. My view about the consultation is that people should point to the difficulty that maintaining paragraph 11b will cause. But the government has said that LPAs will only be able to do that when they can demonstrate hard constraints, such as major flood problems, and that they've exhausted all other options. So that option of not meeting the standard method figure remains, but it will be perhaps harder for local authorities to demonstrate it. Crucially, though, and point 6, is the position on the Greenbelt, because the Greenbelt is the most obvious way in which local authorities have sought to avoid meeting their standard method figures. And we know 12% of the country is covered in the vast swathes of Greenbelt that exist around our major cities. But the new NPPF introduces a new paragraph 142, and it makes clear that unmet housing need is an exceptional circumstance justifying a revision in the Greenbelt boundary. And I would suggest that's following a proper reading of the Compton Parish Council case and the Guildford High Court judgment. In these circumstances, the new paragraph says local authorities should review Greenbelt boundaries and propose alterations to meet these needs in full, unless the review provides clear evidence that such alterations would fundamentally undermine the function of the Greenbelt across the area, as the planning area as a whole. So it's going to be extremely difficult, I think, for the Greenbelt authorities to claim that they can't meet their need. Point 7 is that the government has reversed the changes that Michael Gove introduced in December 2023, which, as the government say, have had a detrimental effect on supply. So no more 4-year supply nonsense or anything of that kind. We're getting back to the standard 5-year test. Point 8, local authorities, which are being examined at the moment, will be allowed to continue as they are. So there is another group of local authorities that won't be meeting the standard method figure, and making it more and more important that we have a standard method figure which is significantly above 300,000. But, and this is really important as far as transitional arrangements are concerned, everywhere else they must stop and plan for the new numbers. And that means for plans that are in an advanced stage of preparation, including Regulation 19, they will be allowed to continue to examination only if they are addressing the appropriate figure in the standard method, unless there is a significant similarity between the figures. So the test is there a significant gap between the plan and the new local housing figure? And the plan will be able to continue if there isn't a significant gap. But if there is a significant gap, around 200 houses a year, 200 dwellings a year, then there'll have to be a revision to a plan even at the Regulation 19 stage. And for plans which are at an even earlier stage, then they should be prepared on the basis of the new standard method figure. So there's a huge change there for lots of local authorities progressing plans now who have not reached the examination stage. What about the figures themselves? Well, I said I'd return to this issue, and the fact is that there are dramatic changes around the country. If we look at it on a region-by-region basis, the figure for London actually falls. It's reduced from nearly 100,000 a year. Remember, London was intended under the Conservatives to meet a third of all the nation's housing need. But the figure under Labour is now reduced to 80,000 a year, so a reduction of nearly 20,000. And that's because London has come nowhere near to meeting those needs and never got really over 40,000 a year. So as the government says, the new target is ambitious and significant, but it certainly means some of the Greenbelt authorities will be having to do rather more heavy lifting. After that, the biggest increase is, that's a decrease, obviously. The biggest increase is in the southeast of England. That's an additional 18,000, and that will be significant across the vast southeast area, with important increases in numbers. After that, the second biggest increase is in the northwest, 16,500 more dwellings a year, followed by the southwest, 12,000 more. And as the rest are concerned, the east of England, 10,000 more. Yorkshire, 9,000 more. The East Midlands the West Midlands is 7,000 more. And finally, the East Midlands at 6,000 more. So there's thousands more houses that have to be found in each region. And just to give you a flavour of what some of those changes look like. So I live in Cheltenham, although I'm not there right at the moment. And the figure for Cheltenham goes up from 545 under the current standard method to 833 a year. Sasha is down in South Oxfordshire, and the figure there increases dramatically from 575 a year to 1,179. So a doubling of the figure. For Mary in London, not all London boroughs see the figures go down. In Wandsworth, they increase from 2,559 to 3,880. So over 1,000 extra homes in Wandsworth each year. But in contrast, places like Tower Hamlets will see a decrease from 5,190 to 2,177. Where Charlie lives in Kensington and Chelsea, there's an increase from 1,381 to 4,271, one of the biggest increases in the country. Gateshead, up in the north where Paul lives, 417 a year increases to more than double, 909 a year. And it's not like that across the whole of the northeast. Newcastle upon Tyne, the figure drops from 1,417 to 1,345. But there's big changes in lots of different places. Birmingham, for example, a place that Charlie and I know well, 7,174 drops down to just below 5,000, whereas Bromsgrove, an authority close to where both of us grew up, increases from 386 to 704. So huge increases in many, many different areas. And that's a roundup of the position with housing numbers.
Now I'm going to hand over to Charlie, who is going to tell us all about the green belt and indeed the grey belt and the significant changes that are proposed in this area.
Good morning. Welcome from Birmingham, where I'm back doing a planning inquiry at the moment. And I'm going to be covering the green belt section of the new NPPF consultation draft. That's still chapter 13 in the draft. One thing that hasn't changed are the greenbelt purposes in what is now supposed to be paragraph 140 of the NPPF. They've not changed. There was some thought they might include a requirement for landscape or environmental value, but they're staying put and the changes are elsewhere. At paragraph 142, as it's proposed now to be, the concept of exceptional circumstances for a greenbelt review, and particularly for greenbelt release, has changed. And the demands now on local authorities are significantly greater. Exceptional circumstances, we are told, now include, albeit they're not limited to, instances where a local authority can't meet its identified need for housing, commercial or other development, through other means. And in those circumstances, authorities will now be under an obligation to review green belt boundaries and to propose alterations to meet those needs in full. And I note, not just housing, commercial and other development too. And the only exception to that is if the Greenbelt Review provides clear evidence that such alterations to the Greenbelt would fundamentally undermine the function of the Greenbelt across the area of the plan as a whole. So note there, it's not for the local authority unilaterally to refuse the Greenbelt Review. The review itself has to provide the clear evidence that the alterations would fundamentally undermine the cross-area function of the Greenbelt. That's the threshold necessary to surmount in order to avoid greenbelt alterations. So a significantly more exacting requirement on local authorities to meet needs, even in the greenbelt, unless that exception applies. Then paragraph 144 provides guidance upon where within the greenbelt local plans should meet those needs. There's a sort of sequential approach. First consideration should be given to previously developed land in sustainable locations within the greenbelt. Then grey belt land, and I'll come on to what that means in a moment, should be considered in sustainable locations. And only then, after those two categories, PDL and grey belt, only then other sustainable green belt locations. In any case, the locations have to be sustainable. That's what paragraph 144 says. Paragraph 147 makes clear that where green belt land is released for development through plan preparation or review, or indeed development control, which I'll come on to later, then the conditions in paragraph 155 apply. I'll come on to those conditions in a few moments' time. It's important to be aware of the transitional provisions provided in paragraph 226 of the draft new NPPF. That makes clear that the new requirements on plan making will only apply to plans that are submitted for examination on or before 1 month from the publication date of the final draft. There's also a provision that where a local plan has reached Regulation 19 stage on or before the same date, 1 month on from publication of the NPPF, it too is not subject to the new requirements, provided that the plan promotes no more than 200 dwellings below the new figures under the local housing need standard method for that authority. If that exception applies, so if they're within 200 dwellings below, they're not subject to the new rules, but they have to do an immediate review. See paragraph 227. It remains to be seen whether those local authorities that have already got to the Regulation 19 stage and are ready to submit, rush to submit their plans between now and 1 month after the NPPF to avoid the more onerous obligations under the new NPPF. There must be some chance that there'll be a race to submit between now and that date to avoid the more onerous obligations in relation to Greenbelt. So much for plan making. I turn now to decision taking, and there have been some important liberalisations in relation to Greenbelt there too. The first of which is at paragraph 151. 151 is the paragraph that sets out the exceptions to the general principle that new development in the Greenbelt or new built development in the Greenbelt is inappropriate. And Lim G to that list, it's currently 153, but will now be 151. Lim G currently allows for limited infilling or the partial complete redevelopment of PDL, previously developed land, if one of two alternative exceptions apply. Either that the development would not have a greater impact on openness, or it wouldn't cause substantial harm to openness, where it would reuse PDL and contribute to meeting an identified affordable housing need. Well, that's been simplified and expanded, so now the exception applies to limited infilling or partial or complete redevelopment of PDL, which wouldn't cause substantial harm to the openness of the Greenbelt. And that not cause substantial harm to the openness of the Greenbelt gateway to appropriate development isn't any more confined to circumstances where one is meeting an identified affordable housing need. So that liberalises the exception, the PDL exception to inappropriate development. There's now a new paragraph 152 as well, which also applies to decision taking. And that says in addition to the various exceptions listed to inappropriate development, housing, commercial and other development to Greenbelt should not be regarded as inappropriate where the following conditions apply. The first condition is that it would utilise grey belt in a sustainable location. The paragraph 155 conditions, which also apply to Greenbelt releases through plans, are satisfied, and I'll come on to 155 in a moment. And the development wouldn't fundamentally undermine the function of the Greenbelt across the area of the plan as a whole. It's the same test, if you recall, in relation to Greenbelt release at the plan-making stage. And also, the local planning authority can't demonstrate a 5-year supply, or the housing delivery test was below 75% of the requirement for the last 3 years, or, I'm quoting, there's a demonstrable need for land to be released for the development of local, regional or national importance. So, lack of a 5-year supply, failure of the HDT below 75%, or demonstrable need for land to be released. Any one of those three, plus grey belt, plus the paragraph 155 conditions, means development is inappropriate unless it would fundamentally undermine the function of the green belt across the area of the plan as a whole. So quite an important and significant new gateway to appropriate development, which of course doesn't require very special circumstances. What then is grey belt? Well, the answer to that is in the glossary. And that is at paragraph 74 of the consultation draft framework. And that defines grey belt as land in the green belt, which is previously developed land, and any other parcels or areas of green belt land that make a limited contribution to the 5 green belt purposes, but excluding those areas or assets of particular importance listed in footnote 7 of the framework, other than land designated as green belt. So let's break that down. It's not just PDL. The PDL is one category of grey belt land, but in addition, any other green belt land that makes a limited contribution, there may be debates in future about what that means, to the 5 green belt purposes. But anything that's within footnote 7, of the NPPF is excluded. Now, footnote 7 of the NPPF, which is a footnote right at the beginning on page 6, concerns policies that relate to habitat sites, triple SI, Greenbelt, we know that doesn't count because this is an exception to Greenbelt, local green space, AONB, national park, heritage coasts, irreplaceable habitats, designated heritage assets, and areas at risk of flooding or coastal change. Now, there's a degree of ambiguity there about whether, for example, if one of those footnote 7 policies applies, but the land in question is outside the protected area, for example, an area affected by nutrient neutrality, which is outside the relevant SPA but affects it, does the exception from grey belt land apply? Now, that may be something that will need to be looked at in refining the consultation draft, or if not, may need to be looked at in a suitable court case. Areas at risk of flooding or coastal change are exempted from grey belt. Now, one thing that the proposed NPPF, the consultation draft, doesn't do is amend the flood risk section of the NPPF, which has been the subject of debate in various court cases and inquiries recently. And the flood risk policy applies not just to areas affected by fluvial or tidal flooding, flood zones 2 and 3, but also flooding from any source, including surface water. So on the face of it, land which engages the flood risk provisions of the NPPF, including on grounds of surface water, would be excluded from the grey belt. Again, that might be something that can be looked at in consultation responses and the final version. So much for the definition of grey belt. Now for paragraph 155, which is applicable both to plan-making greenbelt releases and to the new paragraph 152 exception to inappropriate development. And 155 says this: where major development that takes place on land which has been released from the greenbelt or on sites in the greenbelt, the following on sites in the greenbelt permitted through development management, the following contributions should be made. Pausing there, it only applies to major development, so small-scale greenbelt development that doesn't amount to major development for the purposes of the NPPF would not be subject to this. And there are then three things that have to be done. At least 50% affordable housing, and then there's words in brackets that say with an appropriate proportion of being social rent. It's not yet clear whether the NPPF or national policy and guidance will say what that appropriate proportion would be, or whether it will be left to local decision makers. Secondly, necessary improvements to local or national infrastructure. Now, it might be thought that that's already a requirement, because if a contribution is necessary to make development acceptable, as it satisfies Regulation 122 of the SIL regs, and should be made anyway. But that's what it says, and it may be relevant to the viability considerations I'll come on to. And then thirdly, the provision of new or improvements to existing green spaces that are accessible to the public. There's then guidance on that. So you have to improve local green spaces in order to justify the loss of the greenbelt land in question. And then there's further provision on that in paragraph 156 in terms of how one goes about providing green space. Paragraph 157 is important because it cross-refers to viability guidance. So what if somebody says, well, we'd love to provide the 155 contributions, but we can't afford to because it wouldn't be viable? Well, the Annex 4, which is at the very final page of the consultation draft, page 84, makes provision on that. It makes clear that a benchmark land value should be established on the basis of EUV, existing use value, plus a reasonable proportion of premium to the landowner. Then there's a provision for a benchmark land value of XXX to allow an appropriate premium. Presumably XXX will be filled in the final version of the NPPF in light of consultation responses. Then it says local planning authorities should set benchmark land values informed by this and by local material considerations. Then essentially it says if you can obtain the relevant development, can make the relevant premium in light of the benchmark land value, then it ought to provide the 155 contributions, and if it doesn't, then permission shouldn't be granted, subject to material considerations. Subparagraph 4 of Annex 4 is important because it makes clear that where it's shown not to be viable to make the 155 contributions, then the weight to be given to the viability assessment is a matter for the decision maker, having regard to all the circumstances in the case, including whether the plan and the viability evidence underpinning it is up to date. And there's a further provision that where viability negotiation to reduce policy delivery has been undertaken, late stage review should be conducted to assess whether further contributions are required. So it's not explicit in paragraph 4 that a viability justification will always be available to justify avoiding the requirements of paragraph 155. On the face of it, subparagraph 4 leaves it open to local decision makers and inspectors on appeal to say that it's the failure to comply with 155 would be capable of being a reason for refusal, even where that would be unviable. It's a matter for an evaluative judgment on the facts of any case. Lastly, on the context of decision-taking, it's worth noting that paragraph 14 of the framework, which gives neighbourhood plans protection from the tilted balance in circumstances where the neighbourhood plan became part of the development plan 5 years or less before the decision date and contains allocations to meet identified housing requirement. That's unchanged, and there's no reversion back to the earlier 3-year period, the 3-year life shelf of a neighbourhood plan that was pre-December 2013 framework. Given that neighbourhood plans don't have to be strictly in accordance with the NPPF, they have to have regard to it, don't have to be in accordance with it, and aren't tested for soundness, so far, subject to any changes to planning legislation, there may be a degree of tension between neighbourhood planning and the new provisions in relation to green belts. And again, remains to be seen how that will be worked out in the final version of the framework and in any inquiries and litigation to follow. So overall, clearly it's positive news for the house building and development sector, and those who advocate and promote development. There are a number, as is inevitable in any case of changes to policy and legislation. There are a number of somewhat ambiguous points that will need to be worked out either in the final version of the NPPF or in subsequent disputes, but very much all to play for. Anyway, that's all from me. Have a good summer, everybody, and look forward to the next series of Have We Got Planning News for you in the autumn.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And now it falls to me to deal with the rest, so to speak. So I'm just going to start by mentioning in the introduction the reference to the written ministerial statement and the policy on 25% first homes requirement is removed. And one of the questions you are asked in the consultation is whether or not you support that. The other next thing I want to draw attention to is the changes to the presumption in favour of sustainable development in paragraph 11D, because in the context of policies which are out of date, triggering the tilted balance or the presumption in favour of sustainable development, gone is the reference to, quotes, the most important policies for determining the application, and that is replaced by the policies for the supply of housing. And it's quite clear in the accompanying consultation document that the government is clear that they want to strengthen the need for the delivery of housing because of the paltry amount of up-to-date local plan coverage that there is. Less than a third, they tell us in the consultation document. So, and they also recognise that there's been a lot of debate in planning appeals and in the courts about the meaning of the most important policies. So they see this as a simplification and, as I see it, a strengthening of the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And a paragraph which I thought was definitely worth quoting from the consultation is this: it is important that land that has not been allocated in a plan can be brought forward for development when needed, particularly in the short term. So I see that as a very clear indication that in areas where there is not up-to-date local plan coverage, they are strengthening the presumption, and you can expect local and appeal decisions to improve the delivery of housing. Gone is the removal for the 4-year housing land supply that was in the December 23 footnote 8. We're in much clearer territory. We are back to a clear 5-year housing land supply requirement of deliverable sites, or we're looking looking back in the context of housing delivery. The delivery is substantially below less than the 75% of the housing requirement over the last 5 years. So again, they're stripping away the tweaks that were made in December 2023. And again, they're very clear that that is because of the chronic undersupply of housing land in the accompanying consultation. And the additional thing of interest is the additional tailpiece that they are adding to the very end of 11D2, which effectively says that the tilted balance needs to be applied when assessed against the policies in the framework as a whole. This is the new bit, in particular, those for the location and design of development and for securing affordable housing. And they say very clearly in the consultation that the reason they're doing that is to ensure that planning permissions are only granted where high standards are met, and that the reference to location, design and securing affordable housing, these are safeguards to ensure that only the high-quality schemes, as it were, benefit from the strengthened presumption in favour of sustainable development. So, Chapter 5, on a point of detail, I thought it was interesting that looked after children are a special additional group to be added to those groups whose housing needs need to be clearly identified. And local planning authorities are advised that the evidence of need can be found in local authorities' children's social care sufficiency strategy. So I thought that was interesting, and it feels to me that that's quite a personal emphasis from our new Secretary of State. Planning policies should specify minimum proportions of social rent. So I think that's indicative of the emphasis that is being given to affordable housing, particularly, but not limited to, social policy. You'll remember that there's a reference currently to 10% in the context of major applications. There's a reference to 10%. That 10% reference is gone. I don't see that as a sort of weakness. I see that as an indication that the government is looking to strengthen the delivery of affordable housing. And of course, the funding of affordable housing is something that they are conscious of, and which we will have to wait until the spending review in the autumn to really understand the money that they're going to put behind the delivery of more affordable housing. Chapter 8 deals with promoting safe and healthy places, and that's the first time you see the reference to beautiful being removed. That's not to say that high quality design doesn't continue to be important, but I thought that was noteworthy. The other thing that's really interesting in chapter 8 is paragraph 99, to which there is added this stipulation: significant weight should be placed on the importance of new, expanded or upgraded public service infrastructure. So that I think that dovetails in really with what Paul was saying, which is that there is an emphasis on infrastructure. There's an emphasis on public service infrastructure. So if you were looking to promote the release of land in green or indeed grey belt, including upgraded public service infrastructure as part of your proposals, I predict will be very valuable. In Chapter 9, promoting sustainable transport, no longer does the text talk about appropriate opportunities for taking up sustainable transport. It talks about the need for a new vision-led approach. So we should see local plans setting out that new vision, and one hopes that is an effort to get more emphasis into active travel. It doesn't actually reference active travel, but it seems to me that that would make for a healthier society, not to mention a more carbon-free society. And the other interesting detail in paragraph 114 of the NPPF, which tells us that of the very limited circumstances in which planning permission should be refused on account of residual cumulative impacts, it says that you should only refuse where the residual cumulative impact on the road network is severe. That's the current guidance. And what's suggested is an addition to that, which says in all tested scenarios, which on the face of it seems to be a weakening, if you see what I mean, of the test. I find that slightly strange. Not sure that the decision maker necessarily wants to give the same weight to all of the tested scenarios. So I find that slightly peculiar, and I invite all transport consultants to focus on that and respond accordingly, and indeed highway authorities to respond accordingly. Chapter 11, making effective use of land. They're very clear here that using previously developed land within settlements should be regarded as acceptable in principle. And paragraph 29 and the reference to uplifts in density not being allowed if they're wholly out of character is gone. The detail about mansard roofs is also gone, although the principle of uplifting, including the use of mansards, is not. So I take that to mean that we are promoting development within settlements, and we are also promoting and expecting to see clear increases in density in urban areas. Chapter 12, the emphasis, as I say, on good quality design remains, but the need for beauty does not. And I think that's going to just remove a lot of subjective arguments. And that's good for clarity all round. Chapter 14 is important. That deals with climate change. All forms of renewable and low carbon development should be supported. And here's another stipulation: significant weight should be given to proposals which contribute to renewable energy. Plans should identify suitable areas for renewable and low carbon development. At the moment, it's plans should consider doing that. No, they've got to do it. So again, there's much more emphasis and support for all forms. I think that's really important. All forms of renewable and low carbon development. And the other thing that's going on is that the NSIP regime is being invoked in relation to onshore wind. So we're going back, as it were, to where we started from in relation to that. And as has already been indicated, that footnotes 57 and 58 have already gone. And the other little tweak in Chapter 15 is that footnote 64, which referenced the availability of agricultural land food production, another December 2023 introduction, is also proposed to go. So that is a summary, as it were, of all the other bits and pieces of the NPPF consultation. And I do hope, viewers, that you have found this short but pithy, extra special Have We Got Planning News for You useful. And we very much look forward to seeing you in September with the new edition of the show. Thanks very much for listening, and bye for now.
Enjoy the summer.